So first, I'd like to start off by acknowledging that this virtual presentation is taking place throughout the unceded territory of California, which is home to about 200 tribal nations. In particular, I'm speaking to you from Pomo ancestral land in Hoplin in Mendocino County. We acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants of our various regions, and we encourage you to learn which tribal nations are indigenous to the area where you are now living. One excellent source of information is Native Land, and Sarah has dropped that link into the chat for you to explore later. Our speaker today, Kendall Calhoun, is a PhD candidate in the Brashears Lab at the Department of Environmental Science, Policy and Management, also known as ESPN at UC Berkeley. Excuse me, I lost my page here. His research interests involve around understanding how global change pressures impact community ecology and conservation. Currently, Kendall uses camera traps and acoustic recorders to understand the impacts of California wildfires on native mammal and bird communities. And today we're going to learn more about how wildlife species may be responding to the recent uptick in severe wildfires occurring across the state. Kendall was raised in the Central Valley of California, but he currently lives in Oakland, and he's active on Twitter and he's a founding member of the organization Black Mammalogists. I have the good fortune of being based out of the UC Hoplin Research and Extension Center, where Kendall's field site is located. And I've seen him speak to California naturalists in training here, as well as other interested in public. And we've invited him here today because his research is so relevant to so much of what we're all experiencing around the whole state of California with wildfire. So I want to welcome you, Kendall, and please take it away. Thanks for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you, Brooke. And thank you also for having me and inviting me. I'm excited to speak to you all. Let me get my presentation set up. 1 second. That's not the beginning, sorry. There we go, okay. Okay, does it look okay? Great, okay. So as Brooke mentioned, I'll be talking today about understanding, or some of my research looking at how different wildlife species are responding to these recent wildfires in California. And my research mostly takes place in Northern California, Hoplin of Mendocino County, but I'm hoping that the research that I'm doing there can be applicable to many regions across the state. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the research I'm doing also at the Hastings Natural History Reserve, which is another UC reserve system as well. So I wanted to start off by just talking about, oh, it's cut off a little, I'm sorry. There. I wanted to start off by talking about how I came to be interested in some of this work. And I came to grad school really interested in learning about conservation and how and why conservation is important for, benefiting wildlife in this era of global change, specifically wildfire in this research, but also in the face of several other pressures, including climate change, habitat degradation, and others as well. This slide is showing an assortment of the great biodiversity that we see not only at Hoplin, where all these pictures are from, but across the state, and specifically in oak woodlands, which are known to be mega biodiverse. And all of these pictures are coming from camera traps or photos that I've taken while in the field. And a lot of them stem from a passion that I've had since I was young in nature, biodiversity, and trying to understand and connect with the natural world around us. Similarly, I love how places like Hoplin and across California are composed of such different biodiversity. And I often compare them to, ensemble movies. So movies like The Avengers or Love Actually, or movies like that, where you have all these different species or, groups of people playing their individual roles in this movie, but interacting in really interesting and complex ways. And in this sense, I'm talking about ecological interactions across an ecosystem. And if we're talking about wildfire, it's really interesting to think about how these individual species are able to either respond, recover, or maybe not recover in response to some of those dramatic events. So a lot of the ecological research that we are talking about in this regard thinks about how the interactions between these different species can facilitate stability or resilience to some of these ecological events. But I think it's really important to remember that people are part of this network as well, and the decisions that we make that affect other species in these ecosystems are going to go on to affect their ability to persist or recover after some of these extreme events. So I want to blow this out up to looking at wildfire across California, and specifically megafires. So these two figures are from a paper that just recently got accepted. On the right is a map of California broken down into 4 very broad land cover categories. So conifer, hardwood, grassland, and shrubland. And if you look closely, these red fire perimeters are all the megafires that have burned within the state in the last 20 years. And one of the key pieces of motivation to this study to look at the composition of megafires is that fire management in the US is focused predominantly on one ecosystem type for hundreds of years, specifically conifer forests. And we know a lot about how to manage conifer forests and using prescribed fire and other management tools to benefit those systems. But if you look like across the state, megafires are happening not only in the green here, conifer forests, but across a myriad of different habitat types. And here on the left, you can see this is the area burned in each habitat type over time. Shrubland makes up a huge proportion of the total area burned from year to year. And you can see that it just skyrockets last year in 2020 for conifer and shrubland. And in fact, shrubland is the most commonly burned habitat type if you're looking at total area burned across each of these habitats in California. Paradoxically, though, we don't have as many management tools or knowledge on how to effectively manage wildfire in shrublands or even hardwood forests like oak woodlands. So I'd like to talk specifically about oak woodlands. This is a picture of what Hoplin looks like. It's a classic oak woodland with a variety of different oak species interspersed with shrublands and grasslands, home to various mammal species like this brown bear, or black bear, sorry, bat species as well, and many bird species. As I said before, Hoplin is characteristic of oak woodlands in that it supports a wide variety of biodiversity. The acorns of oak trees are able to support a wide variety of species through the food source of the acorn. Populations of many species, including rodents, deer, jackrabbits, are all supported by these acorns, and the species that eat those herbivores are all thus dependent on that acorn subsidy as well. And Hoplin's also interesting in that it has a sheep rearing kind of facility. So there's an intersection of human livelihoods and wildlife populations, both cohabitating this interesting oak woodland area. So here's a breakdown of Hopland in terms of vegetation. And our lab actually started working at Hoplin before I joined in 2016. So initially our lab set out a 36-point camera trap grid across the entire property. That's what this picture is in the top left. So these cameras were all spaced 750 meters apart. And the purpose of this grid was to look at how deer populations were changing over time, and specifically in response to the annual hunt that happens on site. every year. In addition to camera traps, we also had about 20 deer collared per year, GPS collared. So we could look at individual deer movements across the property. And we were using camera traps, deer collaring, and also fecal transects to understand how deer populations vary across the landscape. And if you look closely here at Hoplin, it's actually composed of many of the major habitat types I was just talking about that we studied for that first paper in California. There's chaparral at the top, and then throughout Hoplin, interspersed woodland, oak woodland, and grassland. So the fire that I'm specifically studying here at Hopland is the Mendocino complex fire, which at the time was the largest wildfire in California recorded history. I think the 2020 fire just north of this in the Mendocino National Forest surpassed this. So it's now number 2. But I think that is just a testament of the current uptick in severely large megafires, which will potentially continue to increase as time goes on. So here down in south, outlined in blue, is the Hoplin Research and Extension Center. And you can see that this is the river fire, which kind of bisects the property. So about half of the property burned and the southern part remained unburned. And then the river fire is only the southern part of the much larger Mendocino complex fire, which in total burned 410,000 acres. And you can see the Hoplin is just dwarfed by the entire burn perimeter of this wildfire. And I wanted to share, this is a picture of Hoplin just a couple months following the fire. It's some parts actually look like a moonscape, but it looks a lot different now. There's varying levels of recovery in different areas of the landscape now, but this is just to give a visual of what had occurred right after. So I now want to talk about the first part. How are we monitoring community assemblages following wildfire? And I'll be talking about a couple of different taxonomic groups in this section. But first I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the hypotheses that drive this part of my research. So potentially high severity fires in some of these areas can dramatically change vegetation. And this change in vegetation may have adverse impacts to oak mortality. So if you remember, I was mentioning that acorns are an important food source for so many species in this system. So if acorns become less available, various populations might decline because of the loss of food. Also, the changes in physical structure of the vegetation may affect the distribution of different wildlife species. And then also there might be a longer term lag on the effects of these wildlife populations. It might not be in the first couple of years where we see the impact of the fire, but instead it might be 10, 20 years out, especially because oaks operate on such larger timescales, right? An oak might live for hundreds of years before it successfully regenerates, like more acorns. And then large disturbances could disrupt or rearrange existing food webs and interactions. And this is just kind of a question in whether if certain species are able to persist while others are not, will this rearrange or rewire the existing food web, and how will those changes in interactions affect the surviving or remaining species? So I mentioned in the beginning that we work with mammals and birds, specifically large mammals, bats, and birds. I'll talk a little bit more about how we do that with our camera traps. So here on the right is a picture of me checking one of them across our grid. We had 36 Rarconics hyperfired trail cams across the property. They were initiated in 2016, so 2 years before the fire, and they're still going. So we have pre-fire data and post-fire data that we can look at together. And we normally have these cameras running year-round, and they're checked 4 times per year. And really surprisingly, I think almost all the cameras survived the fire. So remember I said that about half the property had burned, probably around here. So 25 of the cameras were north of that. So 25 cameras were burned during the fire. So we have post-burn data. And then 11 cameras were unburned just south of that, which makes a really cool control to compare with our burned cameras. So it's turned out to be a really cool opportunity to look at the effects of the fire like immediately following its actual event. So this is some of the preliminary data that we're looking at from our cameras. And a little bit later in our activity, we'll talk about like how we actually sort out this data. But on these 2 graphs are showing the total detections of different species on cameras in burned cameras on the left and unburned cameras on the right. So what I want you to pay attention to is that, so each color on each row is a species, and the x-axis is moving over time. This red dotted line is the fire event. So if you look, just kind of like in general on the burned camera graph, detections actually look like they go down for a little bit right after the fire, potentially meaning that overall species are less likely to use some of those burned areas. And if we look really closely, we can see that this green color, which is gray squirrel, drops very, very much following the fire. And we actually, I'll show you a closer look at another figure of that. But we think that gray squirrels were potentially very vulnerable to that high severity oak and shrubland fire that happened in the northern part of the property. And then in comparison, you can see that in the unburned areas it remains relatively the same. So we can use that as a way to compare how different species are responding across these different burned or unburned areas. So I wanted to look specifically at a couple of different species. So this is me just pulling out an individual species from that previous graph and just plotting how many detections we get of them over time. So originally we get many, many more detections of deer in the burned cameras, which makes sense since we have 25 burned cameras and only 11 unburned cameras. We should expect, just by the number, we would get more, more deer detections in the burned cameras. And we can actually see that over time, it looks like they're going down anyway. But especially after the fire, and especially in 2020, the number of detections we get of deer on the unburned cameras is just as many as on the burned cameras, which I think may suggest that either deer are, less likely to use the burned areas potentially, or they're potentially moving to the unburned areas following the fire. Again, this kind of has to be taken with a grain of salt because detections can vary based on the landscape. So the camera might be able to take images easier when the fire is able to clear all the vegetation. So you can imagine that, like, if there was a shrub in the way, it'd be harder for it to take pictures of deer or whatever. But after the fire, it might be easier for it to take pictures of whatever is passing by. So that might affect the rate of detection for some of these species. But we can use statistical analyses like occupancy to get at to control some of those detection differences and actually look at whether or not those changes are statistically relevant. So let's look at another species, coyotes. So you can see here, immediately stands out that after the fire, there's a huge spike in how many coyotes are detected in the burned areas. And I'm still thinking about some of the reasons this may be. It may be because coyotes are easier to detect in the burned area just because there's less vegetation, but it could also mean that they're actually choosing to use those areas, maybe because it's easier to find prey without cover. Could be, and coyotes are known to be very generalists, so they might be able to just adapt quickly to those areas that had burned. And also, we've also seen that mountain lions and bears, the big predators in these areas, are less likely to use the burned areas following fire. So potentially coyotes could be increasing their activity in response to that because there are less of those apex predators to, induce fear from them. So yeah, that's another question we're looking at. And then finally, looking at our gray squirrel detections, we can see that there are many, many more gray squirrel detections in the burn cameras, but that falls drastically following fire. And it's only just in 2020 about as equal as the unburned camera detections. All right, so on top of our existing camera grid, I also wanted to look at how birds and bats were responding to the fire. I don't have pre-fire bird and bat data, so this data is only looking at burned and unburned areas post-fire. And I'm using acoustic recorders that are paired to each of the camera grid points. So every place there's a camera, I also have put an acoustic monitor as well. And I'm using these audio moth units. They're super cheap and tiny. They're like $60 each, and they work really well so far. I do the acoustic sampling March through June, so the breeding season when birds are doing their unique call, which you can use to identify to the species level. And I sample the dawn chorus, so I do 5-minute audio snapshots before sunrise, during sunrise, and after sunrise. And these recordings are done for 4 mornings at each sampling grid location. And so far, I've had about 50 species observed via the acoustic recordings. I'll talk in a minute about how we actually assess what those species are. And for the bat side, I do a very, very similar kind of method. I deploy these mini bat units, and I have 6 of them, so I rotate these 6 units across the entire site. And this sampling is done at the same time as the birds from March through June. And again, I do 4 nights of sampling. And instead of being timed recordings, these bat recorders are more similar to the camera traps where they're triggered by the species actually being present. So instead of where the cameras are triggered by motion, the bat detectors are triggered by ultrasonic calls being initiated near them. And it records that ultrasonic call. And each bat has a characteristic call that we can use to identify it. So this is what I'm doing right now. How do we classify bird and bat species to the species level? So for bird classification, we can actually use our ears or auditory means because we can hear their calls, unlike bats. So one of the options is I could listen to each of our recordings by ear, and the method I'm hoping to use for these are occupancy models, which take into account the presence or absence of these species. So I would have to listen to each call or each recording and mark which species were there and which species weren't there. Alternatively, and what I'm trying to do right now is use an auto classification software. In this case, it's called BirdNet, which reads the sonogram produced from each of the audio file clips and then match it, or it uses an algorithm to assign the calls it hears to species that it has in its database. Or we could use citizen science, where we have people who really know birds, probably more than I do, to listen to each of these calls or recordings by ear and then record the species that they hear. Bat classification, as I was saying, is a little different because we can't hear the bat calls. Instead, there are various auto classification softwares that you can use. I'm using Sonobat West. So it actually, same as BirdNet, it takes the sonogram produced by the sound file, and each bat species has a characteristic call, and it uses an algorithm within the software to assign those sonograms to a species. Yeah, so these have been super useful. I haven't had the chance to use something similar to this for the cameras. All the camera data is done by hand, so every picture is looked at by my eyes or someone on our team's eyes. And that could be, it turns out to be like hundreds and thousands of pictures. So I have a little bit of the bat preliminary results. I think I've had, I can't remember, I have like maybe 17,000 calls detected by our bat detectors, but only 6,000, just over 6,000 of those are actually accepted and classified calls by the software, which is, I think, still pretty good. So these are the results from the last 2 years of our data. We have 14 species detected total. And as you can see, the composition and richness of these detected species does vary by some of the sites. And I haven't looked closely yet at if there are specific differences related to the burned or unburned sites, but that will be my very next step to look at. Okay, so now I wanted to give like a brief kind of wildlife ID activity so you could see kind of what the bread and butter of this project really is. If I'm not, struggling with statistics, I'm normally IDing camera trap images or trying to listen to bird song or doing bat IDs as well. So I'm gonna start with camera traps, and I'll like put up a picture and would like you all to either put in the chat, maybe that's easiest, what species you think it is. And we'll do the same thing for the bird song. I have 2 bird song examples. And then the real challenge will be if anyone knows the bat sonogram. So let's jump in. All right, so does anyone, I should bring up the chat. What is this? Cool, okay, yes, people are getting it. Yes, gotta love the coyotes. Let's see. Yeah, so this is one of our sites at Hoplin. It's one of the unburned sites. Coyotes are, as I said, pretty interesting in that they can be opportunistic and generalists. They kind of take advantage of whatever situation they find themselves in. And I think they take pretty charismatic pictures, but yeah, you all got that. Okay, what is, oh yeah, coyote. What about this one? Yeah. Okay, I'm seeing it, yep. So yeah, this is a little gray fox. same camera site. I train my undergrads often. They're helping me sort a lot of these pictures, and coyote and fox are often confused by people who are just starting, but I think foxes have much rounder faces, black tip tail, much lower to the ground, arguably cuter. But yes, this is a fox. Same unburned site. Okay, next one. This one's might be a little tricky, but what is that? Yes, someone already got it. Exactly. It is a spotted skunk, yes. So this is one of the new camera sites that I've just put up in Hastings. I kind of like a dream of mine was to get a picture of a spotted skunk, and I haven't done that in Hopland yet, but maybe one day. But yes, this is a spotted skunk. They're a little smaller than the striped skunks, and they're a little more elusive. So it was really cool to get this picture. They also do handstands, so maybe if you can try to Google that. I think they do that in response to being threatened. But hopefully our next picture is a spotted skunk doing that. Okay, next. Yep, I'm saying it. Mountain lion, cougar, puma, deer cat. Yeah, all the above. I don't know if there's another species with so many common names, right? But yes, this is back at Hoplin. Our mountain lions are elusive. We haven't seen as many, especially after the fire at Hoplin, but apparently they're much more common in Hastings. We've gotten so many pictures of them, and we've only put the cameras up, I think, in January, and we already have as many detections of lions as we normally get at Hopland in the same amount of time or for a whole year. So I'll talk a little bit more about lions at the end of the presentation, but yeah, that was great. Okay, here's another kind of trick one. This one's kind of mean. So, okay, I will just give it. This is what we call a ghost. So, one of the banes of cameras is that when the grass gets really long and it's moving and it's warm, you'll get 10,000 pictures of nothing. And we normally sort those into, yeah, you could call it wind too. These have their own dedicated folder called ghosts. And we get, I don't know, we probably have 1 million pictures of these false trigger ghosts. And actually, we're thinking about using these to assess vegetation cover before and after the fire. So there's some use to it, I think, to track how the vegetation has changed pre-fire to post-fire. But otherwise, it's just hundreds of pictures that you kind of need to sort through to get to the actual wildlife. Oh, do you see someone see something? Oh, a real ghost. I wouldn't be surprised. But yes, sorry, that was kind of a tricky one, but yes. All right, so now we'll move on to birds. So for the birds, again, we have these 5-minute clips that we use for the acoustic data, and I've kind of just like I've trimmed that down to get like a small clip that I can play for you all. So let me know what you hear. I'll play it one more time. Yep. Yeah, that's what I hear. Acorn woodpecker. They're probably the most common and maybe obnoxious birds on the recorders. They're calling all the time, and they're everywhere. And they also destroy our cameras sometimes. We have a few cameras that have their lenses just like busted open by acorn woodpeckers, and then they store acorns inside the camera. So yeah, they're very mischievous. But yeah, so you're able to hear that with your ear. Essentially, we'd be giving that sound file to BirdNet, and it would compare the sonogram, like the graph of the sound, to its database of assigned sonograms and species, and basically find a match. So it would look at the sonogram, it would be like, that looks like my acorn woodpecker sonogram in my database, and it also assigns like a confidence score to how confident it is about that classification. So I'm in the process now of trying to validate how accurate BirdNet is for our data, and hopefully I can use that to save ourselves some time in classification, and instead just find the appropriate confidence levels to use for each of these species and accept. Okay, one more bird. it's kind of far and distant, and you have to listen behind the Acorn Woodpecker. Yep, that's a Western Meadowlark, I think. I'm pretty sure it's Western Meadowlark. Yeah, as you can see, or as you can hear, one of the other problems with the acoustic data is that you very rarely have one bird calling. It's very often many birds calling over each other. And for us, using our ears, it might be okay to disentangle what those species are. But it can create problems for the software, because again, it's graphing all the sound in a sonogram. So if you have various sounds being graphed on top of each other, it can make it difficult for the program to assess appropriately what bird or species is actually calling. And that's kind of why I'm going the process now of validating how accurate the program actually is in assigning species for our data, at least. Okay. Now, this is the very challenging one. Are there any bat ecologists who can recognize this call? I'm still learning bats, so I had to look this one up. Someone said pallid bat. Californicus is, I think, a little bit higher in frequency. Big-eared bat. No, we do get all the species at the site, but this is actually silver-haired bat. And is that no, that's a different species. But yeah, these are all good guesses. I think we have all these species present at the site. And again, I'm still learning some of the IDs. Someone is asking, yeah, so these sonograms are at least validated by people visually. So each of the bats have a characteristic frequency or frequency range in which the echolocations are actually recorded. So if you look here, the energy of this, or I don't know if that's the right term, but the power of the call is centered here. And it's around 30 kilohertz per millisecond, or sorry, 30 kilohertz. And that information is used by the software to assign, or at least assess, which species it might be that's making that call. It also can we can also take into account the shape of the call. So different bat species will have very steep calls in terms of changes in frequency over time. And we can use all those characteristics to validate which species is actually making that call. The software is able to read the sonogram for each of these, and then similar to BirdNet, compare it to its database to assess which species it thinks it is. And then we similarly can use our eyes to validate whether or not those calls actually make sense. Okay, so that is kind of as I said, the bread and butter of what I normally do day to day in trying to assess all the species that we're looking at. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and check my time. Okay, I'm going to talk finally about specifically about the movement responses of deer to this wildfire. And I have I think it's been a really interesting story looking at specifically deer. So if you remember, our lab has been collaring black-tailed deer at Hoplin since before the fire. So we have a lot of pre-fire movement data. We have a pretty good idea of the home range of deer before. So one of the initial questions of having deer that were collared at the time of the fire and following the fire is what is the capacity of these deer to adapt to megafire in terms of their movement and behavior. And specifically, how do those changes in movement and behavior, if they're changing, compensate for some of the dramatic changes that are occurring after the fire? And then finally, are there ways in which some of these changes in movements are impacting other ecological interactions as well? What comes to mind specifically is predation. So mountain lions are the big predators of deer in this habitat. So are there choices following the fire affecting, how lions are able to, successfully get prey or unsuccessfully get prey following the wildfire as well? And we can also think about deer are also, they're, I'm thinking, browsers specifically on oak seedlings and saplings. So depending on how oaks are able to regenerate following the fire, and how deer choose to use space following the fire, it may also affect how oak woodlands are able to regenerate years following. So this is how we normally catch our deer. This is a clover trap, and that's my lab mate Janelle in the back. We normally do deer collaring in the summer or early fall, and that's when food is actually kind of scarce because it's all dry, and we use bait in our clover traps to bait our deer in. Collars all have a 1 hour fixed rate, so every hour it's taking a GPS point of the deer. And they normally last for 1 year. So after a year, the collars are programmed to automatically come off of the deer, and then we just recover the collar and download the data. And as I said, we have movement data since 2017 to, it's actually not present. I think our last collar recovery was late 2020, but that's still a lot of deer data to look at. And that comes out to about 90 deployments. So some of our initial hypotheses looking at this are that deer are going to preferentially use some of the lower severity patches in their home ranges over high severity. And I think that makes sense in terms of, the high severity areas potentially are going to have lower food availability, lower cover, and just be areas that, if you're a deer, you probably don't want to hang out in. Deer will potentially make more directed movements. So more directed movements through their high severity burn areas and in chaparral. And again, I think they wouldn't want to spend too much time in those high severity areas that are bare and just open, especially if they're trying to avoid predators or find food. And then finally, this is potentially deer might choose to use some of the low to medium severity areas preferentially following the fire, due to the fact that after low to medium severity fires, a lot of nutrients are actually returned back to the ground, and it can make really nutritious green up the following years. And I think we saw potentially some of this at some parts of the property. Okay, so we actually have some early results of some of this, and this was done by a few of my lab mates and I, and it was led by an undergrad honors thesis, Sammy Krilling, in the bottom corner. And what we found is that deer temporarily leave their home ranges, but they quickly return. And quickly, as in like the following day, they're back and where their original home ranges were. And we see that deer remain faithful to those original home ranges, but for most deer, those home ranges double. So if you look, this graph is showing you the estimated estimated home range of one specific deer, K1. So in blue is the home range of that deer before the fire. And then pink is the post-fire home range calculated using the GPS points that were collected. So as you can see, it's about twice as big as the pre-fire home range. And we think that this may be due to them trying to compensate for the lack of resources by expanding the amount of space that they're using. We also found that deer were more likely to use woodland habitat as opposed to grassland and chaparral. And again, I think this may have to do with the fact that they are trying to find areas that are still wooded or have existing vegetation to eat and for cover. And this GIF is just a small representation of like what each dot is one of our deer at the time of the fire. So you can see they're all making little kind of micro movements, or most of them are making micro movements probably to avoid the direct flames. But you can see that this deer is making very dramatic movements. We'll see when it restarts. I think this is over the course of 12 or 24 hours. So let's see when it restarts. So yeah, it's starting here. This is J3. I think it makes like a 3-kilometer movement away from its home range to avoid the fire. Oh, here we go. Yep. It's leaving home, but then I think the next day comes all the way back, which is very surprising to me. And I'm also surprised that these deer didn't do the same thing, because all of this is actually directly on fire at some point. So having deer collared through the event of the fire has actually been really interesting to look at how behaviors are, individually specific to some of the deer, and how some of these strategies may have benefited various deer. So the ongoing question is how deer habitat selection might change over time. We know that the landscape is going to recover over time, and it'd be important to look at how their habitat usage and choices changes in response to recovery or non-recovery. So this is really technical. I'm using resource selection functions, which is a way to take into account covariates from the landscape, like ruggedness, severity, vegetation type, to look at where deer are choosing to use and where deer are not choosing to use. So as an example, if you look down here, if you look at the red dots, these red dots are all the GPS points taken from this deer K2 over a certain time period. And these blue dots are all randomly generated within its home range. And we can compare the red dots that are actually used to the blue dots that are randomly generated to see which habitat types or soil severity or canopy heights are actually important for selection for this deer, because it's going to select the red dots are going to be, selectively chosen by the deer for various reasons related to these covariates. And then secondly, we can compare how the movement decisions of these deer might change over time and across the landscape. So here, this figure is showing we can take like the trajectory of these deer across, a 2D space, and we can compare how that is changing across different covariates. So you might imagine that this deer might be in a low severity area where it can meander more because it's not as exposed or the vegetation isn't all burned down. But we could imagine that an individual deer in a more high severity area might have a very different trajectory where it's making very direct movements through some of those open areas. So I hope to be able to compare how individual deer are making those movement decisions and how those decisions might be related to changes in covariate or covariates related to fire. And this is all related to some of our other collaring efforts, which have been, kind of mixed success. Early on, we wanted to try to collar mountain lions, which has been unsuccessful up to this point, but I think it'd be really interesting to look at how predator and prey movement dynamics are responding to extreme events like wildfire. Oh, someone asked a really good question that I want to address. We did not find, all the deer that we had collared did not die. They all survived. And we did notice, however, that by using the camera traps, they did lose body weight. So potentially they weren't getting as much food as they were able to, or would normally be able to. But we do know that they were able to survive. We don't know if it was able to, if that change in food resource affected fecundity, or like whether or not they were able to have fawns the following year. But it'd be interesting to follow those individual deer if we can into the future. What was I saying? So yeah, I would like to compare how mountain lion movements may be changing in response to these changes in deer movement. And then secondly, we are also trying to, or are actively collaring coyotes at the property. I mentioned before that coyotes have been really interesting to look at because they look very adaptive to the fire and actually using many of the burned areas. So I'd like to see how that translates to their actual movement in the burned area versus the unburned area. And I just wanted to end by, I think it's really important to look at some of these ecological issues from a very, community-wide breadth, looking at various species and how they interact. I mentioned that, oak woodlands are super important to the integrity of this ecological system through the way they sustain many different species, populations of species, but then also how these species are interacting on these oak woodland landscapes. So the way that the decisions that deer make over the recovery period of the fire are going to affect the regeneration of oaks, but then also affect how, whether or not lions are able to use the area effectively to persist. So I'll end there by just acknowledging my lab, who I would not have been able to do any of this if they hadn't started to work on this before I started grad school. So I'm appreciative of them. So many others who've helped me with the bird and bat data, learning how to understand how to organize it. And then the staff at Hoplin, Allison and Troy, have been just amazing, and none of this would be possible without them. And then newly working with Jen at Hastings has been just so fun. So I'd like to thank all of them and my funding, various funders. And end really quickly by saying, I didn't get to talk too much, but please look out for Black Mammologist Week, which I believe will be coming back. I'm pretty sure it's coming back this September, I think. It's an organization focused on uplifting and really highlighting the achievements and history of Black mammalogists in the field of ecology, when it's very often not recognized. But it also doubles as an opportunity to foster mentorship and actually like grant money for young Black mammalogists who are looking to get into the field. So please visit the website and then also check out the Twitter for updates. And I just say thank you, and I'll end with my contacts and answer any questions you all have. Thank you.
Thank you, Kendall. That was fantastic. I want to echo Black Mammologist Week was really fun to participate in last year. CalMat promoted a lot of the events, and it's all free online, and there's just like experts from all around the country and actually internationally talking about their research, and it's a really fun thing to participate in. So we just have a few minutes left. I'm going to go through a few highlights of questions. I'm sorry, we're not going to get to all of them. That always happens. It's just the way it goes.
Sorry, I talked too much.
One question we had from Thomas was, could it be that post-fire species appearances are indicative of increased dynamism and foraging? So for example, can increased coyote sightings, could those be due to the necessity of greater mobility, perhaps the same few coyotes? Are you able to like distinguish that?
Yeah, that's a good point. It could be like similar to, if we're thinking about the deer, like it might be that we know that the deer have had to expand their home range just to compensate for the lack of resources. So if we're similarly, if coyotes need to be more active to compensate for the lack of, specific food or the availability of prey or other resources, that could make it so that they are detected by the cameras more just by virtue of them moving more. Another good point to think about is that when we put the cameras out, we have like specific trails that we put them on, like kind of like wildlife highways that are very active. And the fire can actually change those highways. Suddenly it might not be a good, it might not be a good spot following the fire. And that's something that we're trying to think about and also compensate for in our analysis.
Right. And then as far as scavengers go, do foxes, coyotes, and bobcats scavenge deer meat? Are there some other animals there that are scavenging for potential deer?
Oh, like carcasses?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think we have images or like support to see, like we've seen coyotes and I think bobcats definitely. Bobcat, definitely coyotes, maybe bobcat. But you know, the big ones are bears. So as soon as a bear finds a carcass, it's gonna take it for itself and, you know, push all the other mesocarnivores away. But yeah, we've seen also rare events of coyotes trying to take deer. I have a couple cameras of coyotes trying to attack like big bucks, and I'm like surprised by that. But yeah.
All right. Dina Ramlin wanted to know, and I think I counted 14 different species of bats that you found, which is pretty neat. I didn't actually realize we had that many here. Did you detect any bat species that were not already documented here? And I know she works with graduate students that do bat work. So
yeah, I don't have, so I was looking at Cal Naturalist for the Hoplin list of bats, and I was looking at that way before I did my bat organization and cleaning. So I need to compare with that. Or if there's a more organized species list of Hoplin bat species, I'd love to compare with that to see if there are species that were detected by our grid that weren't already on that list. So yeah, that's something I just need to know who to talk to. Yeah.
Yeah. And then just one last question, and this kind of goes back to, I had a question about oak recruitment, and I know we've had a hard time with oak recruitment here at the Hoplin Rec due to grazing and other factors. Is there any research about how quickly a fire-stunned oak returns to growing more acorns? This might affect the decline in squirrel populations.
Right. The oaks continue to amaze me. I'm not sure. I'd love to talk to a like dedicated oak ecologist, just because many of the oaks that I've seen where I thought, oh, it's dying, like there are no leaves, it hasn't like greened out for the last 2 years, suddenly it is alive. Like it's really amazing that how resilient they can be. But also there are oaks that look like, I don't know, maybe Brooke, you know, many of the oaks are still falling as well around the property. So there are probably a lot of factors that are controlling the end result of some of those oaks, and I'm not totally sure. I do know acorns are falling in some of the areas that still have standing trees, but I don't know how long it'll take for the burned oaks to, you know, regenerate enough to produce them again. I can say that I didn't have this on that data, but squirrel detections are continuing to increase, at least. They're not as high as they were, you know, pre-fire, but I think that might just be due to squirrels from outside of the areas recolonizing those burned areas.
Makes sense. All right, I want to thank you, Kendall. That was a great presentation, really interesting work with a lot of different implications that we can apply to all the different places we live in California. So really appreciate you joining us today. Thank you.